And I think that's the wild thing. I mean, when you look at Warcraft 2, that was a 12-month dev cycle, right?
Yeah, we noticed
that's
that.
Crazy, right? It's crazy talk. I always maintain that Warcraft 2 it was almost like a mythical creation that came out. I'm not kidding. Like
defies gravity.
Every single decision we made on that game happened to be the right one, and it doesn't discount.
If there is one year in Blizzard's history where they really figured out who they were as developers, that year would be 1995, and Warcraft 2 was the fruit of their evolution. At the start of said year, they hadn't quite abandoned an idea they had during the first game's development to shift the setting with the new games, but they had narrowed its scope a little bit. What they were thinking was still orcs and humans fighting each other, and still in the same world, but the humans had advanced to use modern technology, or close to, and the orcs would now be riding dinosaurs into battle. But eventually, and kind of sadly, they gave up on this idea. Work proceeding from there seems to have gone quite smoothly in general. They already knew what they wanted to make, essentially the first game again, but better. Just better. It's almost strange that there are sequels out there that don't follow this idea. As such, they effectively relied on the first game as a design document, rather than planning anything out in too much detail. Between the releases, we also saw the dawn of a bit of a competition. Warcraft Orcs and Humans ended up being the first game to follow up on Westwood's Dune 2, but as it turns out, Westwood were hoping to do that themselves. Thus a rivalry between the studios that would span the 90s was born. Westwood responded to Orcs and Humans with Command & Conquer, which boasted a more responsive and intelligent control system and more interesting asymmetrical balance. To this day, there are those who would consider it one of the best RTS ever made. Then it was Blizzard's turn again, and as I'm sure you've guessed by now, they came up with Warcraft 2: The Tides of Darkness in December of 1995. And just like Command & Conquer, there are those who would still call it one of the best RTS ever. The reason for this longevity is quite varied, but not difficult to see, especially after playing the first game, because in many ways it is still a very charismatic playing experience today. I had a moment of amazement when I started it up, and couldn't believe how easy issuing orders was now. I am not saying it doesn't show its age at all. Some features now considered standard are missing. For example, you cannot queue. That's either training units or issuing orders, but it's a hell of a step up from the last one. Introduced in this game are such things as left-click selection and right-click orders, mouse scrolling, and control groups. One might even argue that the Warcraft franchise is more the legacy of this game than it is the first, since this sort of ease of play is what made the series so appealing to so many, both as an RTS and an MMO. While the first game can be called important, this one deserves to be called something more impressive. It deserves to be called great. Now, let's address the story. Or specifically, how the story got from the end of the last game to the start of this one. On that front, we immediately have a problem. What actually happened at the end of the last game? If any of you didn't watch the previous video, most likely because it was shit, the last game's campaign was split into two alternative timelines with very different endings. So which one happened? On some level, I just don't like that a canon has to be chosen. I think if games give choices, then they should not be reversed. But I'm willing to sidestep it here because I doubt anyone really minds for this game. In the end, like the first game, we just want to get back into the wars, and it's not really about the story. That's just there for some context. Thinking on it, it may have been really cool if this game's human campaign had taken place in the timeline where the orcs won the last, and the orc campaign took place in the other timeline. Thus, either way, you are playing the underdog. However, that's not what we got in the end. The game made an executive decision that the orcs were victorious. So Blackhand is overthrown by the player character, who's now called Orgrim Doomhammer, Stormwind is destroyed, and the humans run away to the north. Oh, and Medivh died for some reason. Once again, referring to the manual, we find some new information that was not from the last game, which involves one thing that could be called a retcon, something that Warcraft 3 is not without either. While I'm not in the loop about WoW, it's my understanding that this still happens at least from time to time. In this case, the opening of the portal was not purely due to the Orcs capitalizing on the rift Medivh created between the worlds, but Medivh takes a more active role now by striking a deal with the Orcish warlock Gul'dan. Due to the manual being told from the point of view of in-universe characters, in this instance we can chalk it up to an unreliable narrator. More broadly though, the question of retcons is honestly pretty hard for me. It is obvious that it can ruin the sense of importance of previous events, as well as more generally break immersion when rules are just ignored. On the other hand, it may allow you to approach a situation from a far more interesting perspective if the previous writer, who may indeed be you yourself, have been too rigid with what they allow. What I do hate are retcons that make a situation simpler, or perhaps less engaging would be the way to say it. If you are going to force the lore into a new shape, then at least do it to raise some interesting questions and not to dodge them. The best fix would be to plan ahead from the start and write the first story so that you don't need to retcon anything later. But unfortunately, there are a lot of reasons why it just won't end up that way, even if you haven't done anything foolish in your writing. The clear question to be asked then is, where do you draw the line? How do we know when we are going too far? There is no right answer to that. It is something you have to figure out for yourself. Concerning Warcraft 2 and Warcraft 3, I think it is acceptably slight. Now, covering what happened between games, at the end of the First War, Azeroth, once the largest and most prosperous kingdom in the world, has become a burning wasteland. The title of most prosperous kingdom has assumably passed to Lordaeron. Its king, Terenas, arranged an alliance with all the other kingdoms, including that of the dwarves and that of the elves, in preparation for the orcs' eventual move north. Sir Lothar, who was among the survivors of Azeroth, was put in charge of the armies, and the priests of the last game became the paladins of this one. On the Horde's end, we learn that Doomhammer is not the convenient puppet Gul'dan had with the previous warchief, Blackhand. He actually destroyed Gul'dan's warlocks as a demonstration of dominance and forced Gul'dan to swear fealty to him. But Gul'dan continued scheming for his own ends afterwards. Gul'dan convinced his new master to disband the Wolf Raiders, I don't really know why, and then went on to turn the old Necrolites into the Death Knights. This conveniently explains where all those old units from the last game went in this one. Chris Metzen was now in charge of these lore movements and was originally going to kill the Wolf Raiders altogether, but Bill Roper suggested that they should be disbanded instead, just in case the writers wanted them again in a later project, which indeed they did. Glad to see they're trying to avoid the aforementioned retcon issue. What I like most in the manual though is the introduction of the kingdoms and clans composing each faction in the war. It's a simple but effective way to give you the political state of the world, and tells you how to identify each of them via their unique in-game colors. Thus, later in the campaign, when you notice that the Orcs Humans are attacking you, you know who you're dealing with, provided you've read the manual. Like the first game, a grand cinematic will introduce this one to you. It shows the orcs following the humans over the seas on the backs of ships, which will soon be playable in-game, and verbally informs you of the new allies the humans have acquired: elves, dwarves, and gnomes. Who'd have thought? The orcs didn't miss out on new alliances either, picking up ogres, trolls, dragons, goblins, and, turtles. This does mean new units, of course, such as Demolition, Scouts, and Heavy Melee Mages, but the bigger effect is on style. The design of the units from the first game was distinguishable enough, but a lot of the fighting units probably gave very similar vibes. Not anymore. What we have now comes across more of a mismatch of cultures that understand the importance of joining forces to fight for a common cause. This is emphasized further by the new voices. Rather than every unit of a faction sounding exactly the same, now each and every one of them have their own, except for ships, that is. You can bet that the developers use this to drip personality everywhere, and it also means that clicking on the units too many times has a wider variety of responses. And of course, thou shalt not play a Warcraft game without spam clicking the units.
We're not brainless anymore.
Quite a number of new features can be seen in the gameplay itself, not the least of which would be the new interface, building on Command & Conquer's smart command structure. Also introduced was the Fog of War, as mentioned in the last video. Now I'm going to argue the exact opposite point, that the extra map awareness it demands is very good for the game, because the effort you used to spend on just giving your units orders can now be put to that instead. The system worked so well that it instantly became ubiquitous with the genre thereafter. Of all the new introductions though, one is clearly the most exciting. It's plastered right there on the box. The battles are not just on solids anymore. No, we've managed to rope fluids into it as well. Air units and water units. In theory, this enriches the game by adding new strategic considerations that must be balanced with what was there before, and for the air, I think it does. The air combat units are very powerful in raw terms, but they take a very long time to get going, and even when they do, they are cost effective versus just about nothing that can actually fight back. And that's aside from the friendly fire potential. Therefore, they function more as shock troops or something to help finish a game that you've already won, rather than being an especially noteworthy fighting unit. The ships are less well integrated though. When you have two different fields of battle, water and land in this case, you want them to still interact with each other. If they don't, you haven't really added complexity to the game, you've just added another minigame in it. Now, to be fair, even if they were completely separate, there would still be the budget of resources to assign to each. But this game is not just about building armies, it's also about using them. So clearly the introduction of ships would be most valuable when stuff is happening on the coastline, like shown now. Some maps are well designed to facilitate this, but many are not, with limited landing zones creating a very slow and dull interaction, and many others having huge open bodies of water, which take up a lot of real estate without adding anything that smaller bodies would not have. I think the design of the ships themselves is also flawed, because it's not really the scissor paper rock game one might expect. Rather, it's all about this one ridiculous powerhouse unit, and everything else is just support for it. Thus, army compositions end up being very samey. Make no mistake, nothing else in the game is even close to a match for the battleships or the juggernauts. If your opponent does not have air units, then get one zeppelin or flying machine to detect invisible units, then mass as many of your heavy ships as you can. That will quite simply obliterate everything on the water. Even said air units are usually a pretty small investment to counter, though they require at least a few destroyers in your navy. Okay, but those heavy ships are high-tech units. What about the early versus late game dynamic? Well, if you have a secure oil patch near your base, then you can hold out from the land just fine until the late game. If you don't, then fair enough, but that's still flawed map design for a different reason. It runs the risk of an early game lead snowballing way too hard, making it impossible for the other player to get on the water at all. Basically, the ships are not really designed around strategic thinking and timings like the land units are. They are purely an arms race. Weirdly, this powerhouse unit structure is how Warcraft 3 works, but that game is much more micro-focused. I do not think this is the right choice for Warcraft 2. That's quite a long explanation to simply say the biggest selling point of the game doesn't really work, at least not as well as it could have. Again though, maps which are better designed can allow land and sea units to start fighting each other, and quickly the interactions become a lot more interesting and diverse. I haven't checked myself, but I would hope that this is how multiplayer maps are built. Whatever shortcomings this system has, it's forgivable, because there is another change which is less exciting, but far more important. The first game had a road system that forced you to build your bases together. That is completely cut. This allows two very important new abilities, expanding to a new gold mine and building forward military structures during your attacks, both of which massively improve the playability of the game once the early game defensive phase is over. I feel like nitpicking though, so I'll point out that the small annoyance of this system is that the AI will not regroup around their roads to rebuild their base, so you may have to hunt across the map for 1 or 2 lone units or buildings before completing the mission. God, I feel like I'm being too negative. It's a really good game, I promise. Once again, the campaigns run in alternate timelines and are not very narratively dynamic, effectively with the same issues seen in the last game. Though the twists, such as a betrayal or an in-game character death, are much harder felt now. The sense of progression comes again from new units expanding your army as you go, and with some cinematics accompanying the end of each act. They show seemingly random events for the most part that have nothing to do with the story, but still serve as a compelling reward. Also, like the last game, the first few missions are largely a tutorial, with a more explicit tutorial in the manual should you want it. Then, it'll let you loose with more flexible maps and much more exhilarating tactical options than were ever seen during the first game. A slight difference in the campaign's philosophies is that after the first 4 maps, the humans and orc campaigns are no longer using scenarios that are a slight variation on the same idea, but rather different ideas altogether. They can indeed vary quite a bit from their counterparts, if it is even appropriate to call them counterparts anymore. This encourages the players to play both campaigns as opposed to just playing through the one they prefer, which is perhaps the first sign of the continuous story structure we see in later Blizzard RTS. Starting about halfway through the campaign, the difficulty will ramp up extremely quickly. Aggressive attacks will keep you on your toes, and proper scarcity of resources will encourage you into action. Clearly something had been learned since the first game. You will now also find that there are multiple sensible approaches on each map, along the lines of everything in the game has at least 2 counters to keep in mind. Unfortunately, there are still some hurdles. The AI, for instance, is very easy to cheese, and the introduction of towers, while it has its advantages, also discourages engagement into bases a little too much. These together simply encourage you to stay out of distance and knock down a fortified position from there, which is slow and less involved than starting a proper fight. I think this could have been solved by removing cannon towers and leaving only the guard towers. But if it is sufficiently open, you can still force your way in with some bloodlusted ogres. At least the orcs can. The game's balance favors that faction overall now, a reversal of the last. However, our caveat is that on water maps the humans start looking stronger because of their invisible transport raids. Now, it is my experience that what works in single player isn't necessarily the best strategy online, but it is still easy to see that Bloodlust is ludicrously strong. In the meantime, the counterpart the humans have is the heal ability, which is quite underwhelming. heavily contrasted to how imber it was in the first game. But considering that it's attached to such a late game unit now, it might have actually been okay if it had stayed that strong. These are far from as bad as the balance issues in the first game though, so let's call that progress. This time, the canon ending went to the humans, but most of the events from the Orc campaign were kept intact. Pretty much all of them except its conclusion, which I'm okay with because it was quite a whimper. Aside from having way too much open water space, I'm still whining about that, there's nothing about it that tells you this is important, that it decides the fate of thousands. It's not necessarily that hard to do. The only thing the first game did was have a unique sprite on one building. A simple trick, but it worked wonders. This just feels like any other mission, followed by an impressive but ultimately forgettable closing cinematic. What about the humans finale then? It starts with an annoying landing challenge, but after that it is everything it should be, with multiple phases that test different aspects of your ability to play the game, and a constant challenge without feeling insurmountable. It also didn't skimp on a unique look. Not just the art of the portal itself, but the entire layout of the map wraps around it in a way which signposts its significance. The closing cinematic is even more impressive than the Orcs one too. Bottom line, it's no wonder this ending was chosen for canon. Once again, we can ask what to do after the campaigns, and once again multiplayer is a good choice, or single player against the AI. Warcraft 2 introduced new technology to enhance modem play, allowing 2 players to play off one disc. Good stuff! But there's something else that's even cooler. A new front of engagement was added to the game, the map editor. Now, not only could you play with your friends, but you could play what you had made yourself with your friends. This is the first RTS to have done this in Blizzard's lineup, and I believe the first ever, across the board. While our logical or strategic minds would have been quite satisfied with the game alone, we now have something for the creative mind to latch onto as well. Many game developers' origin stories begin with an editor not too different from this one. My first was the original Age of Empires, which I spent more time with than I should probably be happy to admit. I think this feature, more so than any other, is responsible for the incredible long life this game has had, and many other members of the genre too. While much room for improvement was still there, and advancements were made in later games, once again, the legacy can be traced right back to this series. Returning to the story, upon completing the human campaign, you watch the wizard Khadgar destroy the Dark Portal. The feeling is certainly triumphant, epic, and nice? Yeah, let's say nice. On the surface, this looks like a full ending. It's not just a defeat for the Orcs, but severs their very ability to meet the humans again, leaving us in a place where the franchise could end right here. Ah, but there were 2 main cliffhangers from the end of the first game. First, the Orcs following the humans north, which we have now fulfilled. And second, the Orcs opening more portals. What if they could do that?